They were the deadliest beings the galaxy had ever produced. Zarek Thomar, the shadow assassin, stood perfectly still, his serpentine frame coiled with latent energy. His skin, a dark iridescent hue, seemed to absorb the light around him, making it impossible to focus on his form for more than a fleeting moment. Beside him was Kroner Zeke, a towering mass of muscle and sinew. His reptilian features were marred by scars that only hinted at the countless battles he had endured and won. The last of the trio, Xylo Venner, radiated an unsettling calm. Her androgynous, almost featureless face was framed by a faint halo of light, a visual manifestation of her psychic prowess. Where the others were physical terror incarnate, Xylo was the unseen force that could turn thoughts into weapons. Zalric's voice sliced through the oppressive silence, a smooth yet cutting tone that demanded absolute attention. "Humanity has become a threat," he began, his words laced with contempt. "They are a species that thrives on chaos, destruction, and greed. In their short existence, they have annihilated their own ecosystems, turned on each other in ceaseless wars, and now they dare to reach beyond their fragile world. The Council has deemed them a plague, one that must be eradicated before it spreads." Zarek tilted his head slightly, the motion almost snake-like. "Plagues are often inconspicuous, Arbiter. What makes these creatures worthy of our attention?" Zalric stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the room. "Because they adapt. They survive where they should perish. They conquer where they should cower. If left unchecked, humanity will burn the stars themselves." A flicker of interest crossed Xylo's otherwise blank expression. "And what are their defenses?" the psychic asked, her voice a haunting melody that seemed to echo inside the minds of everyone present. "Primitive," Zalric replied, his lip curling in disdain. "But don't mistake their simplicity for weakness. They fight with desperation, with a savagery that defies logic. That is why the Council has chosen you, our finest. You will not just exterminate their leaders or topple their governments. You will obliterate the very essence of what they are. Leave no hope. Leave no resistance." Kroner let out a guttural chuckle, the sound reverberating like a drumbeat. "Finally, a challenge worthy of my blade. Tell me, Arbiter, do they scream like the others?" Zalric's gaze hardened. "You may indulge your curiosities, Kroner, but remember this. Failure is not an option. Should you falter, the Council's wrath will be your reward." The assassins exchanged glances, a silent agreement forming among them. Zarek, ever the pragmatist, broke the silence. "It will be done. By the time their sun rises thrice, humanity will be a memory." Zalric nodded, satisfied. He raised a long, spindly hand, and a holographic display materialized before them, showcasing Earth in vivid detail. Points of interest, military installations, communication hubs, key population centers, were highlighted in crimson. "This is your playground," he said, his voice dripping with finality. "Now go. Show them the meaning of inevitability." As the assassins departed, their forms dissolving into streaks of light that vanished into the ether, Zalric allowed himself a moment of stillness. He gazed at the hologram of Earth, his expression unreadable. "Adaptation," he murmured to himself. "Let us see how far it takes you." Across the void on Earth, the mood was far from calm. The bunker's air was thick with tension, the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave. Commander Daniel Reynolds stood at the head of the table, his hands pressed firmly against its steel surface. Around him, the most powerful leaders of the fractured world argued, their voices rising in overlapping crescendos that echoed off the concrete walls. "We can't fight what we don't understand," one shouted, slamming his fist down. "They're coming to exterminate us, and you want to talk strategy?" another retorted. Reynolds straightened, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Enough!" The room fell silent. His piercing green eyes scanned the group, daring anyone to speak out of turn. "We've intercepted their message. We know their intent. This isn't about negotiation or diplomacy. This is survival. An older man at the far end of the table, Colonel Graham York, leaned forward. His gravelly voice carried the weight of decades of war. Survival against what, exactly? Our intel says these assassins are unlike anything we've faced. We can't rely on conventional methods. Reynolds nodded, his jaw tight. Which is why we need to consider unconventional options. The room tensed further. Everyone knew what he was implying, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Finally, it was Carlos Wells, the youngest and sharpest intelligence officer in the room, who broke the silence. You mean him? Reynolds didn't flinch. Yes, him. A murmur rippled through the group, a mixture of disbelief and dread. York's eyes narrowed. Jonathan Mike is a ghost. Even if we could find him, there's no guarantee he'd help. Reynolds stepped away from the table, his tone resolute. John Mike is more than a ghost. He's our last line of defense. If anyone can stop these assassins, it's him. Wells leaned back in his chair, skeptical. The Baba Yaga. The man who dismantled the Russian syndicate single-handedly. The man who walked away from it all after. Enough! Reynolds interjected, his voice firm. We don't have the luxury of doubt. Find him. Bring him in. Convince him, if necessary. York grunted, rising from his seat. If he's still out there, he's not the man he used to be. You're betting the survival of humanity on a broken blade. Reynolds met his gaze, unyielding. A broken blade can still cut. The meeting adjourned with heavy hearts and heavier minds. As the leaders dispersed, Reynolds lingered, staring at the digital map of Earth projected on the wall. Each red felt like a countdown, a reminder of the limited time they had to prepare. Quietly to himself he muttered, God help us if he says no. Deep in the ruins of old Moscow, where snow-covered streets met crumbling skyscrapers, a figure knelt in the hushed silence of a forgotten chapel. The faint glow of stained glass bathed him in a kaleidoscope of colors, though he seemed oblivious to the beauty around him. Jonathan Mike, once the most feared operative in human history, now looked like a man weighed down by ghosts. His dark hair was streaked with gray, his face weathered, yet his eyes remained sharp, glinting with a dangerous intensity. The creak of a distant door shattered the stillness. Mike didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes and sighed. I told you people to leave me alone. Carlos Wells stepped into the chapel, his boots crunching against the icy floor. Behind him, Colonel York kept a watchful eye on the shadows. This isn't a social call, Mike, Wells said. We need you. Mike finally stood, turning to face them. His presence was commanding, even in the dim light. Need me for what? Another war? Another mission? I'm done. York stepped forward, his tone harsh. This isn't about you, Mike. This is about all of us. The Council has sent assassins. If we don't stop them, Earth is finished. Mike stared at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, his gaze softened. You people never learn, he said quietly. But beneath his words, there was a spark, a flicker of something long buried, but never truly extinguished. Wells took a step closer, his voice steady. We don't need the man you are now, Mike. We need the Baba Yaga. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Mike reached for the gun strapped to his side. He checked the chamber, the metallic click echoing like a promise. Fine, he said. But if we're doing this, we do it my way. The cold wind howled through the steel corridors of the underground command center, rattling the thin metal vents and carrying with it a sense of unease. Jonathan Mike stood in the dim light of the armory, his sharp eyes scanning the walls lined with weapons. Rows of assault rifles, energy cannons, and experimental grenades gleamed under fluorescent lighting, but his hand lingered on a simple, worn combat knife. He ran his thumb along the blade's edge, his expression distant yet focused, as if the weight of what lay ahead balanced on its edge. Behind him, Carlos Wells leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed, observing the man they had risked so much to find. Mike hadn't spoken much since his reluctant agreement to join the fight, but there was an intensity in his every action, as though his very presence charged the air. Wells broke the silence, his tone casual but probing. "So, is this where you give us a speech? Maybe some profound words of wisdom before we send you out to face 3 of the deadliest beings in the galaxy." Mike didn't turn. Instead, he slid the knife into its sheath with a practiced motion and finally spoke, his voice low but cutting. "Speeches don't save lives. Preparation does." Wells smirked faintly but pressed on. "Fair enough. But these assassins, Zarek, Krana, and Xylo, they're not just soldiers. They're predators, each one designed to hunt and kill with precision. You've read the files. You know what we're dealing with. So tell me, Mike, how do you plan to fight something that thinks faster, moves faster, and kills faster than anything you've ever faced?" Mike turned then, his gaze locking onto Wells's. "You don't fight them. You outthink them. They're killers, not strategists. That's their weakness." Colonel Graham York stepped into the room, his heavy boots clanging against the floor. His presence immediately commanded respect, the aura of a man who had faced countless battles etched into his every move. "I hope you're right, Mike," he said gruffly, placing a data tablet on the nearby table. A holographic map flickered to life, showing a detailed layout of Zurich and its surrounding areas. "Because their next target is here. Strategic Command estimates they'll strike within the next 24 hours. Mike studied the map with a calculating eye, his fingers tracing the city's grid. The layout was dense urban, with countless points of entry and exit. It was the perfect hunting ground for the assassins, and a nightmare for anyone trying to defend it. He tapped a section of the map, a large industrial complex on the city's outskirts. "They'll come through here. It's isolated, minimal civilian presence, but crucial to our communications infrastructure. It's exactly the kind of target they'll want to cripple." York nodded, impressed by Mike's quick assessment. "We'll position a team there, but let's be clear, you're the tip of the spear. If they show up, you'll be the one facing them." Mike met York's gaze without flinching. "That's the idea." The briefing ended quickly, and as the team dispersed to finalize preparations, Mike remained behind, alone with his thoughts. The weight of the task ahead didn't intimidate him. It never had. But there was something different this time, something deeper. The stakes weren't just about survival or victory. They were about proving that humanity, for all its flaws, was worth saving. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, and let the silence steady him. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. The industrial complex was shrouded in darkness, its machinery silent as the night. Mike crouched on the catwalks above, his silhouette hidden among the shadows, his ears attuned to every sound. The team position on the ground below was tense, their nerves frayed by the knowledge of who, or what, they were up against. Then it began. The first death was silent, a soldier dragged into the darkness by an unseen force. The second came with a flash of movement, a serpentine figure striking like lightning and disappearing before anyone could react. Zarek Domar had arrived. Mike didn't move. He watched from above, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the assassin's movements. Zarek was fast, impossibly fast, his form flickering in and out of the shadows like a living phantom. But Mike wasn't watching the movements themselves. He was watching the pattern. Zarek wasn't just moving randomly. He was testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses. A soldier screamed as Zarek's blade found its mark, and the rest of the team opened fire, their bullets tearing through the air in a cacophony of chaos. Mike stayed motionless, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle, waiting. When Zarek appeared again, his form materializing just long enough to strike another target, Mike acted. He fired a single shot, the bullet grazing Zarek's side and forcing the assassin to retreat. The room fell silent again, save for the ragged breathing of the surviving soldiers. Mike dropped down from the catwalk, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He moved with purpose, his knife drawn, his senses sharp. He knew Zarek was watching him, waiting for an opening, Mike smirked faintly. "Come on, then," he muttered under his breath. "Let's see what you've got." Zarek didn't disappoint. He struck with blinding speed, his blade slashing through the air with deadly precision. But Mike was faster, not in movement, but in thought. He sidestepped the attack, his knife slicing upward in a calculated strike that caught Zarek off guard. The alien hissed in pain, his dark blood staining the floor. The fight was a blur of motion, each move calculated, each strike deadly. Zarek was faster, stronger, but Mike was relentless, his experience and strategy outmatching the assassin's raw power. When the final blow came, it was sudden and brutal. Mike drove his blade into Zarek's chest, twisting it with precision. The assassin's body shuddered before collapsing to the ground, lifeless. Mike stepped back, his breathing steady despite the exertion. He wiped the blood from his knife and looked around. The soldiers were silent, their expressions a mix of relief and awe. But Mike didn't have time for celebration. He knew this was only the beginning. Before he could issue new orders, the ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. Mike turned just in time to see Kronerzik bursting through the wall, his massive frame illuminated by the flickering lights. Behind him, Xylo Venner hovered, her psychic aura pulsing with an almost tangible force. Mike's jaw tightened. The first assassin had been a test. The real fight was about to begin. The air inside the industrial complex felt heavy, suffused with the tang of scorched metal and the faint coppery scent of blood. The flickering overhead lights cast erratic shadows across the floor, amplifying the sense of impending doom. Jonathan Mike tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing to process the situation. Kronerzik stood amidst the rubble of the shattered wall, his massive, reptilian form a grotesque blend of muscle and armor. The alien's crimson eyes glinted with a predatory hunger, and each of his movements was deliberate, purposeful, as though he relished the hunt. Hovering just behind Kroner, Xylo Venner remained eerily still. The faint glow of her psychic aura flickered like an otherworldly flame, and the space around her seemed to distort subtly, bending the light in ways that defied physics. Mike could feel the pressure building in his skull, a sharp, invasive sensation, as though her presence alone was attempting to pry into his thoughts. He shook it off, forcing his mind to focus. This wasn't the time to falter. "Fall back!" Mike barked at the remaining soldiers. His voice cut through the chaos, and though fear was etched on their faces, they obeyed without question, retreating toward the safety of the adjacent corridor. Mike knew they wouldn't stand a chance against what was coming. This fight was his. Kroner's guttural laugh rumbled through the room like distant thunder. "You must be the one they call Baba Yaga," he growled, his voice deep and guttural, each word dripping with contempt. "I expected more." Mike didn't respond. Instead, he kept his stance low, his eyes darting between Kroner and Xylo, assessing their positioning. He knew he couldn't afford to engage them simultaneously. They were too different, too dangerous in their own ways. Kroner was brute force incarnate, a living battering ram capable of tearing through any defense. Xylo, on the other hand, was an enigma, a silent storm of psychic energy that could unravel a man's mind if given the chance. Kroner took a lumbering step forward, the ground trembling beneath his weight. Mike moved first, firing a burst of rounds at the alien's exposed joints. The bullets ricocheted off Kroner's natural armor with little effect, but Mike had anticipated that. The shots were meant to distract, to force Kroner to commit to a direction, and he did. The towering alien charged, his clawed hands outstretched, aiming to crush Mike in a single, devastating blow. Mike rolled to the side at the last possible moment, the impact of Kroner's strike shattering the ground where he'd stood. Mike came up firing, aiming at the back of Kroner's knees. This time, the rounds hit their mark, finding the small gaps in the alien's armor. Kroner roared in pain, staggering slightly, but his anger only seemed to fuel him further. Before Mike could press the advantage, a wave of pressure slammed into him, sending him skidding across the floor. His vision blurred for a moment as he struggled to regain his bearings. Xylo floated closer, her featureless face tilted slightly, as if observing him with cold curiosity. The psychic assault was relentless, an invisible force clawing at his mind, probing for weakness. Mike gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. He'd faced horrors before, but this was something else entirely. He reached into his belt and retrieved a small device, a spherical EMP grenade designed to disrupt electronic systems, and more importantly, neural implants like the one Xylo relied on to amplify her psychic abilities. With a flick of his thumb, he activated it and hurled it toward her. The grenade detonated midair, releasing a burst of energy that sent ripples through the space around Xylo. Her glow flickered violently, and for the first time, her movements faltered. Mike didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light, aiming for the center of her chest. But Xylo recovered faster than he anticipated. A translucent barrier materialized between them, and Mike's blade glanced off it harmlessly. She retaliated with another psychic push, throwing him backward once more. He landed hard, the impact jarring, but not enough to keep him down. Krana was on him again, his massive frame barreling toward Mike with unrelenting fury. This time, Mike moved to the side, leading Krana toward a series of exposed pipes along the wall. As the alien closed in, Mike fired a single shot at a pressure valve. The explosion was immediate, a jet of scalding steam erupting from the pipe and engulfing Krana. The alien roared in agony, his armor hissing and cracking under the intense heat. It wouldn't kill him, but it would slow him down. Mike turned his attention back to Xylo, who was already preparing another attack. He needed to end this quickly. His hand brushed against the second grenade on his belt, this one a high-yield explosive. He armed it, but instead of throwing it, he activated the magnetic attachment and hurled it toward Krana. The grenade latched onto the alien's scorched armor, the timer ticking down. Krana's eyes widened in realization, but before he could react, the grenade detonated in a deafening blast, sending him crashing to the ground. Xylo's aura flared violently, the psychic backlash from Krana's fall radiating outward. Mike felt the force of it, a splitting pain in his skull, but he pushed through it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a compact, high-caliber pistol, a weapon designed for precision and maximum stopping power. Xylo hovered before him, her barrier flickering as she struggled to maintain her focus. Mike aimed for the center of her form and fired. The bullet pierced the barrier, shattering it with a ripple of energy, and struck Xylo square in the chest. She staggered, her glow dimming as she crumpled to the ground. The oppressive pressure in Mike's mind lifted instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. Mike stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. Krana's massive body lay motionless, the scorched armor still smoking. Xylo's faintly glowing form flickered weakly, her psychic energy fading like the last embers of a dying fire. For a moment, Mike allowed himself to breathe, to acknowledge the small victory. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The Council wouldn't stop with these three. They would send more, stronger, deadlier, and humanity would need to be ready. As the first rays of dawn pierced through the broken walls of the complex, Mike sheathed his knife and walked toward the surviving soldiers, his expression grim but resolute. There was no time to celebrate. The war was just beginning. The air was thick with tension, the kind that crawled beneath the skin and burrowed into the bones. The Council's assassins lay defeated, but the echoes of their onslaught reverberated through the battered remains of the industrial complex. Jonathan Mike stood amidst the wreckage, his figure illuminated by the pale, flickering glow of the emergency lights. His breath was steady, his knife sheathed, but his mind was anything but calm. The battle was far from over, and deep down, he could feel it, a storm brewing on the horizon. Colonel Graham York's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and authoritative. "Mike, we just intercepted an encrypted transmission. The Council knows their assassins have failed. They've sent reinforcements, an entire strike fleet. We have less than an hour before they're in orbit. Mike's jaw tightened. What's the payload? Orbital bombardment. York replied grimly. They're not taking any chances this time. They'll turn Earth into ash. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, but Mike's resolve only hardened. His entire life had been forged in the crucible of impossible odds, and this was no different. The assassins had been sent to kill him because they feared what he represented. A man who couldn't be broken, who could inspire humanity to fight back. They were right to be afraid. Mike strode toward the remaining soldiers, his voice cutting through the din like a blade. Listen up. We've got one chance to stop this. The Council's fleet won't just rain fire from above. They'll deploy troops, machines, everything they've got. They want to crush us, to send a message that humanity is nothing but prey. But they've made one mistake. He paused, his eyes burning with an intensity that silenced even the most fearful among them. They've cornered us. And there's nothing more dangerous than a cornered species with everything to lose. Carlos Wells, his face smudged with dirt and sweat, stepped forward. What's the plan, Mike? Because I'm not about to sit here and wait to get vaporized. A faint smirk tugged at Mike's lips. Good. We're not waiting. We're taking the fight to them. York's voice interrupted over the comms. You're talking about launching a counteroffensive into orbit? That's suicide, Mike. We don't have the firepower. Mike's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, unyielding determination. We don't need firepower. We need precision. He turned to Wells and the others, his tone measured but fierce. We have one functional dropship in the hangar and just enough fuel to get into low orbit. We're going to board their flagship, disable their command systems, and force them to retreat. The room fell silent. The audacity of the plan was staggering, but no one doubted Mike's resolve. Wells let out a low whistle. You really are insane, he muttered, though there was a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. All right, let's do this. The team moved quickly, gathering what supplies and weapons they could salvage. Mike led the way to the hangar, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He knew the odds were against them, but that was nothing new. What mattered was the will to act, to defy the inevitability of defeat. The dropship was a battered, utilitarian craft, its hull scarred from years of use. As the team boarded, Mike took the pilot's seat, his hands moving deftly over the controls. Wells settled into the co-pilot's chair, his expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. You sure you know how to fly this thing? Mike glanced at him, a flicker of amusement in his otherwise stoic demeanor. I've crashed better ships than this. The engines roared to life, the hangar shaking as the dropship lifted off. Through the viewport, the ruined city of Zurich grew smaller. The devastation left in the assassins' wake a stark reminder of what was at stake. As they broke through the atmosphere, the stars unfolded before them, cold and infinite. And there, looming ahead like a dark monolith, was the Council's fleet. The flagship was massive, its sleek design a testament to the Council's technological superiority. Smaller vessels flanked it, their weapon systems glowing ominously. Mike guided the dropship toward the fleet, his movements precise and deliberate. The ship's stealth systems were rudimentary at best, but he used the debris field from an earlier battle to mask their approach. The team moved to the rear of the craft, preparing for the breach. Mike joined them, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Remember, he said, his voice calm but commanding, this isn't about taking out every ship. We hit the flagship, disable their command systems and get out. Stick to the plan. And we might just live through this. The docking maneuver was tense, the dropship latching onto the flagship's hull with a metallic clang. Mike led the way as the team cut through the airlock, their movements swift and silent. The corridors of the flagship were pristine, the sterile environment a stark contrast to the chaos they were about to unleash. They moved like ghosts, taking out isolated patrols with precision. Mike's every step was calculated, his instincts honed by years of combat. The team reached the control center without incident, the massive doors standing as the final barrier between them and their objective. Mike planted a small charge on the door, the explosion controlled but effective. They stormed the room, their weapons trained on the council officers inside. The alien beings, their forms elegant yet imposing, turned in surprise, their hands moving toward their consoles. "Don't," Mike growled, his rifle aimed at the largest of the officers. "Hands where I can see them." The room fell still, the tension palpable. Mike approached the main console, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar interface. Wells stepped forward, his expertise in alien technology coming into play. "Give me a minute," he muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. "You've got 30 seconds," Mike replied, his gaze never leaving the officers. He could feel the weight of their stares, the disdain in their alien eyes. They didn't see him as a man. They saw him as a nuisance, an insect daring to challenge the giants. The flagship shuddered as an alarm blared, the ship's automated defenses coming online. Wells cursed under his breath. "They've locked out the system. I can't disable it from here." Mike's mind raced. They were out of time. He turned to the officers, his voice cold and unyielding. "Who's in charge?" One of the aliens stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He was taller than the others, his presence commanding. "You cannot win," he said, his voice resonating with an unnatural calm. "This is your end." Mike didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said, stepping closer. "But if I go down, I'm taking you with me." In one swift motion, he grabbed the alien by the throat, his knife flashing as he pressed it against the being's neck. "Order the retreat," he demanded, his voice a deadly whisper. "Or this ends here and now." The alien hesitated, its gaze locked with Mike's. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the alien raised its hand, signaling the other officers. The alarm ceased, the ship's defenses powering down. Mike released the alien, his knife still in hand. "Good choice," he said, his tone laced with grim satisfaction. The team moved quickly, planting charges on the key systems before retreating to the dropship. As they detached from the flagship, the charges detonated, the explosion ripping through the ship's core. Mike watched from the viewport as the Council's fleet faltered, their formation breaking apart. For the first time, a faint sense of hope flickered in his chest. Humanity had struck back, not with superior technology or overwhelming force, but with sheer will and determination. As the dropship descended back toward Earth, Mike allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The fight was far from over, but for now they had won. And that was enough.